One of the many things that we've talked, oh, pardon me, one of the many things that we've talked about since 2016 was the whole balancing act that Brexiteers and even the Conservatives since then have tried and have really failed at. And that was, of course, the true balancing act of global Britain versus actually, investing in the UK and, quote, leveling up. Call it what you will. It's had many names over the years, but they haven't done it. And that was always the true balance, because these two sides, these two different factions and beliefs had radically different ideas. And the global Britain one, for example, was our home market did not matter. All the industries, all the businesses here did not matter, because you could go to these, emerging areas around the world that were developing their economies. Like, you could go to South America or you could go to Asia and you could get your stuff at a cheaper price and just import it here. Now, of course, that then raises the question, well, what about jobs here in the UK? What about, all the stuff here? it sort of, raises a lot of, problems and concerns, and vice versa. The investment, the leveling up agenda that was meant to be pursued by Boris Johnson was, we've got to focus in on the UK. We've got to sort of develop our industries and our economies here before we look abroad. And of course, both these two pillars went on a balancing act as to see who would win. But here's the big problem. You've had one side that has just gone, we're not going to bother really investing in the UK. So that's pretty much failed and fallen on its face. So you might think that maybe global Britain has been the idea, the campaign idea, and especially the economic idea within the Conservative Party to win. Oh no. By all accounts and purposes, we are 4 years into Brexit, and it has really failed, because the proponents of this doesn't matter about what trade we lose from the EU, because we can replace it all with all this foreign trade. Now, of course, they're harking back to the old imperial days, where Britain did have this, big sort of trading, empire. But those days are not there. Not only that, they failed to mention the colonies, how those played a part in our economy. The imperial preference system, as it was called back then, harking back to that, but not really mentioning that system. And unless they are absolutely, serious about wanting to go and, recolonize areas, I highly doubt that somehow these areas, they are going to do that, because I don't think anyone in the world would really allow us to sort of go and recolonize, our former holdings. I think other countries might have a lot to say about that, especially, of course, what's going on in the light of, places like Ukraine, Gaza at the moment, Taiwan as well. I don't think that's a likelihood of that happening. So I'm going to go over this piece, because now that global Britain has failed, you then have to ask the question, well, what's next? Like, what do we do next? Now that global Britain has failed as a slogan, as an idea, what next do the Conservatives do, or should they turn to? Well, we're going to find out today what that potentially means and what that could mean looking forward for, well, the Brexiteers, and where do they go from here? So, as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help and support the channel. Like I say, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. Of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. There's a YouTube thank you button, and of course, there's the Pony Club as well down below. So, let's go over to this. This comes from Encompass with the title of Global Britain Has Failed. What next? So, Brexit marked a fresh start for UK trade, After nearly 50 years under the EU's common policy, Britain was now free to set its own tariffs and strike its own trade deals. And Theresa May declared the era of global Britain, as we all remember. Anyway, as a country now committed to free trade and determined to try and broaden its horizons away from the Europe's towards faster growing economies in Asia and the Americas, the newly recruited trade negotiators crisis crossed the globe, trying to seek ambitious deals with the United States, India, and any other country willing to talk. And that says it all. Any other country willing to talk. And of course, we've talked plenty of times about how bad the New Zealand and Australia trade deals are. The Pacific Partnership deal, that's going to be, really bad for us as well economically. There's talks about, of course, Canada potentially vetoing us our membership on that because of them wanting to sort of export beef to the UK as well at the moment. There's all sorts of stuff just going on at the moment, which just do not, shall we say, spell good news for the future of the UK. And when you look at other countries, as we've said before, trade deals are big politics, big politics. Some governments can win or lose depending on these trade deals, and these trade deals do affect countries for quite some time. So, trust me, these trade deals, while they might be, shall we say, being celebrated now, or at least, shall we say, not really talked openly, publicly about, when they actually start to come in, when they actually start to kick in, you're suddenly going to see a lot of pushback against these trade deals. A lot of pushback against these trade deals. So, however, it is now time to concede that May's vision has failed. Brexit has not turned Britain into a global trading superpower. The much hoped for deal with the US, UK's second biggest trade partner after the EU, failed to materialize. Negotiations with India are ongoing, but any agreement that does emerge will be limited in scope and only bring minor changes. New deals, though, have been struck with Australia and New Zealand, and the UK has joined the CPTPP, a new trade agreement between 11 Pacific Rim countries. But these economies are just too small and too far away to matter much for UK trade. As we said, trade gravity. Countries always trade closest with their closest neighbors first before any other country. This is why when the Brexiteers say like the Europe no longer matters, the EU doesn't matter because we can go trade. Sorry, trade gravity is a thing. You can't really escape it. So even the government's own analysis does suggest that the economic benefits of these deals will be very minor, with each agreement expected to increase the UK GDP by less than 0.1%. At the same time, under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement that now governs UK-EU trade, Britain now sits outside of the EU single market and customs union. This change has resulted in the reintroductions of customs red tape and regulatory barriers, leading to higher trade costs. And although these services and trade have provided surprisingly resilient so far, these costs will have sharply reduced the goods trade. The TCA has caused goods imported from the EU relative to the rest of the world to fall around about 20%. Likewise, many small exporters can no longer afford to hire the new staff, simply to compete with the customs forms that they now have seen now see their EU exports collapse. So, what is the future for the UK trade policy? And this is where it gets interesting, because quite rightly pointing out that global Britain, what was meant to be a big pillar of Brexit, has now failed. Well, that's what, again, as we as rejoiners need to start, pointing out that all this stuff has failed. So, the first step is to ditch the myth of global Britain. The EU is far and away the UK's most important trading partner, and accounting for around half of all UK trade. And at the time when advocates for globalization were on the defensive, there is little opportunity to now strike transformational trade deals outside of Europe. Instead, attention needs to shift closer to home. A stronger trade relationship with the EU should be a number one priority. This does not mean ignoring the rest of the world. The UK should be alive to opportunities wherever they may emerge, but for now, officials should be taking more trains to Brussels and fewer planes to Tokyo, Canberra, and other far-flung locales. It should be comforting to think that there is now a renewed willingness to engage with the EU that will very much lead to the dismantling of these trade barriers created by the TCA. Comforting, but wrong. Unless the UK rejoins the single market, there will always be regulatory barriers to UK EU trade. And unless the UK rejoins the customs union, cross channel trade will always be subject to customs red tape. If the goal is simply to boost the economy by around 4%, according to the OBR, rejoining the single market and customs union would be the best option. But absent of the political consensus to take this step, a very judicious combination of negotiations and unilateral actions could mitigate some of the costs of Brexit. Building upon the new recent agreements to rejoin the EU's future funding program for Horizon Europe, objectives for negotiation with the EU should include an agreement on animal and plant health standards to try and ease the flow of agricultural goods across the channel. Improvements on labor mobility should facilitate short-term business trips and give young people opportunities to live and work in Europe. And of course, rejoining Erasmus to allow students to study in the EU. These steps would also deliver tangible benefits to some of the groups hardest hit by Brexit. So all this stuff is possible. It's just going to take negotiations. But we have to have a government that is willing to do it and have these conversations. But like I say, it's not impossible at all. We're just going to have the conversation to begin with. That, I'll upset a load of people by just saying that now, but who cares? But the most important short-term goal should be to avoid regulatory divergence. And this would create further barriers to trade, and the proposed changes to UK regulation should be subject to a cost-benefits test that account to their impact on trade. And any new updated EU regulations should trigger a review of whether the UK would benefit from remaining aligned with EU policy. Shadowing the EU in this way, by example, by linking the UK's carbon pricing to the EU regime, would ensure that the UK exporters are exempt from the EU's carbon border tax. Again, something we can do, which would be very easy to do and just say, yeah, we're going to follow that. It's not impossible to do things like this to keep in alignment with the EU, but you just have to, make the bills, make sure that the policy is and that, civil servants are aware that's what the direction we've got to go in. It's not impossible to do. It's just have to do it. This may be, of course, less glamorous than the rhapsodizing global Britain, but the time for grand visions has now passed. It is now time to focus on the nitty-gritty and rebuild UK trade. So, as you can see, everyone is like, yeah, doing Brexit, it's damaged the economy. If you want to help the UK economically right now, then you got to go talk to the EU. And that has always been, I think, our stance. It's what I think everyone who does want to, rejoin stance, pretty much should be. We go talk to the EU and, we see what we can get in negotiations. It's not, a million miles away. I do not think that the EU would be that willing to say no if we were sort of coming up with sensible proposals and going forward, with stuff with them. And again, it would take negotiations. It's not impossible to do. And eventually, who knows? Maybe if we're following all the EU and regulations, maybe we can rejoin the EU single market and customs union. And then maybe we can eventually, rejoin, the European Union as full members. It's not impossible. Just negotiations just have to take place. And I'm sorry if that upsets people by saying that. But unfortunately, that's what's going to happen. You've got to have negotiations regardless of whatever we do. But at the moment, we do not have a government that wants to, shall we say, engage with the EU. Luckily, we do seem to have an upcoming foreign secretary and a UK business I was going to say foreign secretary, but again, UK business secretary that does want to do that. So I think you will see things change. And of course, as Rishi Sunak proved as well, if you change the mood music, turns out the EU is actually quite willing to talk and willing to negotiate about various problems. So it's not impossible to do. It just takes some gumption and some work and some negotiations. But that's how it will be. So yeah, here you go. So as always, thank you very much for watching, and of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.